start recording, if that's okay. Do you hear me?
Yes, I've started the recording.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we have today, the top of the top of the economists in the world who do IO, and we all benefit from them, in our everyday work, and you cannot get higher. So, if I tried to read their resumes, I would take up all the time. So I'm not going to do that because you all know their names, you all know their work. So we have Steven Salop from Georgetown, we have Dennis Carlton from the University of Chicago, and we have Dan Rubenfeld, who has a leg in NYU and a leg in Berkeley, the best of all worlds. Floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Michal. Let me briefly just say I'm very pleased to be here to chair this session. I'm speaking from Berkeley, California. So Dennis Carlton actually is professor of economics at the Business School at Chicago, and Steve is professor of law and economics at Georgetown. They both have the unusual background as both being distinguished scholars in industrial organization and law and economics generally, but also being active in the consulting world, which I think complements and benefits the work they do as academics. So for the session today, I'm going to just lead a discussion on maybe a little bit of debate between Steve and Dennis on three topics, all related to antitrust law and economics. The first topic we'll begin with has to do with market power. The second will look more deeply into market power, and the third will look at recent decisions and cases involving two-sided markets. And in each of the discussions, I'll ask one of the two to start off and speak relatively briefly, and then we'll go back and forth and see whether we can get see what some of the tensions are, hopefully between the two, and actually tensions in the field. So with that brief introduction and a brief thank you to Steve and Dennis for participating, let's start off with topic one. First topic is what's happened, certainly in the US, but I think worldwide, to market power. There seems to be some agreement that market power has increased in many markets. And the question is, has that happened? And if so, what are some of the implications of increased market power? So Dennis, I'm going to let you start off first. Give you about 5 minutes to set the stage on this issue.
Okay, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here and be on the same panel with my friends Dan and Steve. There is a vast literature, and it's evolving, stimulated mainly by macroeconomists, though microeconomists have contributed, in which the claim is that there has been a large increase in concentration and a decline in a large increase in concentration and a large increase in market power throughout the world, but especially in the United States. And that as a result, there are calls for dramatic changes in antitrust. I'm going to try and summarize just a few high points in this literature. I have a paper soon goes in more depth. And if I go over by a minute or two, take my time away and give it to Steve on the next question, Dan. So let me just tell you, these are studies looking at evidence broad-based over the economy. And they claim that concentration has increased generally throughout the US economy, and that the ratio of price to marginal cost has gone up over the last 40 years, according to some estimates, by 45%. The consequences of this increase in market power has been a decline in productivity growth, huge decline, and a huge decline in business startups. There are a lot of other consequences. I'll just focus on those. So I wanted to give you a very brief response. First, it is correct that if you look at aggregate indices, say at the 4-digit industry level, that there has been an increase in concentration. But if you look at the increases, even using these aggregate measures, which we all know may have many imperfections as proxies for antitrust markets, you see that the concentration levels are not anything like those that would trigger antitrust concerns. So just to give you an example, any conception that manufacturing in the United States based on these aggregate indices is highly concentrated would be completely false. In, say, 2012, last year I have data for, the HHI index, the fraction of firms that have an HHI under 1,500 is 86%. So to claim that the US is dominated by highly concentrated industries based on these aggregate measures is just wrong. Second, and this is probably the most important point, Dempsey taught us long ago that maybe there's nothing wrong when you see increased concentration. Maybe you're seeing increased concentration because the most efficient firms are expanding, or at least that's a possibility. Well, you know what? People have studied this, and they've seen that those industries where concentration is increasing are precisely those industries where productivity is increasing. And the firms that are expanding are the most productive firms. So what this literature finds is that superstar firms have expanded. That means firms with very high price cost margins and innovative products are the ones that are expanding in industry categories, leading to increased concentration and higher price cost margins. But if you think about it for a second, if they're expanding, consumers are buying their products rather than their rivals' products, where their rivals are not enjoying this productivity growth. That must be good, not bad. If you look at some of the claims about declines in productivity growth, I urge you all to read an excellent book by Bob Gordon. And he looks at what has happened to technological change since 1950. And the rate of productivity growth has been declining steadily. If you look at a chart and you ask, well, gee, do you think that has to do with increased concentration? Well, there was an increased concentration, say, between 1950 and 1980, and you see it plummeting. So to attribute declining productivity growth to increased market power just seems wrong. Furthermore, there have been many who have questioned this claim that market power has increased. Maybe the the ratio of price to marginal cost has gone up, but new studies have shown much less than the 45% that's claimed. Maybe 5% that's gone up by, but nothing like this huge amount. And finally, if you look at the decline in new business formation, which is an important variable, what you see, what studies have shown is it has declined, I think by about 30, 40, 50% since 1975. But, here's the big but, there's an excellent paper by Hoppenheim showing that demographics can explain this. That is, new firms are not started by old guys like me. They're started by young guys. And if you look at the US economy and you look at the age distribution and you use that to explain new firm formation, you do a very good job. So my bottom line is this evidence is interesting, raises interesting academic questions. Is it the basis for claiming there should be a dramatic overhaul of our antitrust laws? No. Does that mean if I look at individual industries, I might find from a study that mergers in that industry have been bad and maybe I've done something wrong? That's certainly possible. But to claim that the US economy is going to down the tubes because of increased concentration is an extreme claim and should not be used to justify dramatic changes in antitrust. Okay.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay.
Thanks, Dennis. I forgot to mention that both of you guys have affiliations in the consulting world. Dennis, you're affiliated with Compass Lexicon, and Steve with Charles River Associates, CRA. And we could separately have a discussion about increased market power in these consulting companies, but we'll put that aside. So Steve, I wanted to get your reaction to see whether you agree with Dennis, but and whether or not you agree, or to the extent that there has been increased market power, what are some of the implications that we ought to worry about?
Well, I guess I think that market power has increased. Whether it's increased across the board, it's increased in a salient way for consumers. If the price cost margin has gone up by 5 percentage points, then prices have gone up by, say, 10%, and that's a substantial effect on.
No, Steve, it's
on
the ratio
the real
of price
wage.
to cost. The ratio of price to cost has gone up by 5%.
Oh, okay. Well, that's still a significant amount. But the point I want to make is that market power, increased market power is has a substantial impact on the income distribution, the wealth distribution, and it's made it worse. And we face a really serious inequality problem in the U.S. And for that reason alone, we should be more highly concerned about market power than we might otherwise. And so the question I ask, and this is, my paper on this is a paper with John Baker from around 2013 on inequality. And the question that we ask is whether antitrust can help contribute, at least incrementally, to a better distribution of income. Because many of these causes of increased market power are definitely unrelated to antitrust. So, does antitrust have a role? And I think it does, in several ways. If there's still a debate going on in the U.S., though it's kind of sub rosa, about whether total welfare should be the antitrust standard, or whether the welfare standard should be based on the welfare of consumers or workers in the case of monopsony. And that's a big issue. I mean, the total welfare standard permits mergers and other conduct that benefits stockholders over typical consumers. And since the distribution of stock ownership is concentrated among the rich, that allowing an anti-competitive merger, or allowing a merger that raises total welfare but lowers consumer welfare, is going to have an adverse effect on the distribution of income and wealth. So what should we do about that? Well, let's stop debating total welfare versus consumer welfare and adopt what I call a true consumer welfare standard, not Bork's deceptive use of the term consumer welfare for total welfare. Although I'd expand it to be worker welfare as well in the case of monopsony. Second, we ought to increase agency budgets to prevent more mergers that harm consumers. The data, and I'll talk about this later, the data really shows that the agencies are constrained, and that's led to under-enforcement. Third, we should strengthen merger law so that the agencies can more easily stop more anti-competitive mergers. And then fourth, the agencies should pay attention to the distribution of income. They should focus more on products with lower income elasticities. Gasoline, prepaid wireless phones, supermarket, not foreign exchange, not vacation homes in northern Canada, not yachts. And they should take these into account in their case selection. I mean, I think the poster child is the FTC's case against the lawyers who defended indigent defendants in Washington, D.C. They violated the Sherman Act by having a one-day strike to build political support for getting a pay increase so that more lawyers would be attracted to helping the indigent defendants. Well, the FTC brought that case, and they spent the resources to take it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they won. But the question is whether that was a good use of their resources. Dennis?
Yeah, Dennis, any response or commentary? Before you do, Dennis, actually, I just want to mention, I want to move into the next topic also, which has to do with sort of enforcement explicitly. But do you have any specific response to Steve's comments? If so, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll keep them brief. I agree with a lot of what Steve said, but I would change it a little bit. it is true if the ratio of price to cost goes up by 5%, no one wants a 5% price increase. But what we're seeing is consumers are buying these people's products. So they must have better quality, better innovation. It must be something that's attracting them. So you got to be a little careful. Higher prices are okay if consumers want to pay the higher price for the better quality product. But to get to the point Steve made about the distribution of income, obviously I agree with him. The distribution of income in the United States, we have to do something about it. And there are a lot of ways to do that. It does not strike me in the scheme of things that antitrust should be at the top of my list. So that if I had, $1 million to spend, I wouldn't spend it and I wanted to improve inequality. It wouldn't be giving money to, Steve and me to think about antitrust or to put us in charge of the antitrust division. I can think of better uses of the money at the margin. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Just means antitrust is not particularly well suited for that. As far as merger law, my view as an economist has always been when I go into the agency or when I was, at the agency as the deputy, that when someone comes in with a merger, I fully understand our merger laws don't require efficiencies to be described. But it always seemed to me as an economist, I like to ask, what are the efficiencies? And I think that's not a bad way for an economist to begin understanding whether a merger is going to be harmful or not. And maybe the case law needs to take better account of that if you think there's an inadequacy in the current case law. In terms of agency budgets, I couldn't agree with Steve more. You can't expect a finite number of people to keep working as the economy grows without them having to make some hard choices about enforcement. And one of my colleagues has a very interesting paper in which he shows that as the HSR thresholds in the United States went up, the number of mergers just under the threshold go way up. And that's telling you that perhaps people are trying to use those thresholds and to merge before they reach those thresholds to avoid scrutiny. So I agree with Steve. Budgets should be adjusted over time.
Thanks.
Let me make a couple of comments. First of all, I think it would be a good use of $1 billion to give it to the agencies, because the agencies turn a profit every year. Between the with all the fines from price fixing, they actually do pretty well. And you could probably calculate that eliminating an anti-competitive merger is going to create big benefits for consumers, and so they earn profits for consumers in that way. Not to say we shouldn't be doing other things; we should be doing a lot more in this front. But I really worry about when people say, "Oh, even if you're right that there's a problem, antitrust isn't the right tool," because then you have to ask whether any of the other tools are going to be used. And we know, for example, yeah, sure, changing the tax laws is the best way to change inequality, but there are political constraints against doing that in the U.S. As for the fact that people are buying the products of these companies, well, you need to be a little careful with the way you use that evidence. If the reason that they're buying products from these companies is because the companies have engaged in exclusionary conduct to knock rivals out of business, then you can't use the output test to measure whether people actually are better off from buying the products.
So thanks, Steve. Let me move on to morph into our second topic, which is related to this, which is what's happened in merger enforcement. And certainly an impression one has that enforcement has been somewhat lax in the US, certainly compared to Europe. There's just a revelation by a whistleblower, by the way, if you haven't read it, that suggested that for a while, because of political influence, the US agency was focused on the cannabis industry with significant resources. So you see what's been happening in the US to merger enforcement. Has there been a problem? And if so, have we lost out to the Europeans who have been much more active?
Yeah, well, the whistleblower complaint's really interesting because I've been collecting data on second request, and the 2019 data is not out yet. And in the Elias testimony, he listed that the DOJ had done 31 second requests in 2019, which is really high. And I thought to myself, why? Gee, that really is high. I've been arguing the number of second requests is really constrained. And then I see 9 of those second requests were in the cannabis industry, which were apparently politically driven. But anyway, to go back to the topic, I think there has been under enforcement. I think it has been lax. In my recent article with Fiona Scott Morton, we present a variety of what I would call soft evidence that the agencies are resource constrained and that they're engaged in triage in merger analysis, and that they're very risk averse in going to court to block mergers. And all of those 3 things add up to under enforcement. So let me describe the data briefly. But if you look for the article on the horizontal merger guidelines by Fiona Scott Morton and I, it's on SSRN. You can see the data in more detail. Well, number one, the agency budgets in the last decade have gone down by about 30% relative to the number and size of mergers. So they're budget constrained. Second, while the number of mergers has increased, the number of second requests has stayed basically constant, which really shows that the agencies lack the resources to do more. Third, almost all the second requests lead to challenges, 80–85% in the last few years. So that makes you say, that makes you say, well, gee, they're only going after the most egregious cases, and they're finding that of the second requests, almost all of them need to be remedied. Fourth, when the parties don't accept the settlement, when they don't accept the consent decree, and the agencies file a complaint, the agencies prevail virtually all of the time. In the Obama administration, the win rate was 38 wins, 2 losses, taking into account, I'm not just looking at hearings, I'm also looking at cases where the parties caved before trial. So that's enormous. So that says, gee, if the agency files a complaint, that merger is almost surely anti-competitive. Finally, merger retrospectives tend to show that increased prices with a median of more than 5%. So even where you have remedies, even where you have consent decrees, which happens most of the time, they're insufficient. So taken together, this data suggests there's been substantial under-deterrence of anti-competitive merger proposals, that the agencies don't have enough resources to do enough. They're only looking at the most problematic mergers, and they resolve most of them with weak settlements and only bring the most egregious cases. So thanks, yes, Steve. I do think that's under enforcement.
Thanks, Steve. Dennis, your response?
Well, I agree with much of what Steve says, but not all. As I said earlier, there's no question as the economy expands and you get more mergers, you can't expect the same number of economists and lawyers to be to be adequate. So from the time I was at the Justice Department, which was about 10, 12 years ago till now, I don't think there's been a significant expansion in the number of economists at, say, the DOJ. I'd have to check the exact figures, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, and it squares with what Steve said about the budget's not expanding. So I think that's exactly right. In terms of these merger retrospectives, all I would say is the following. There have been several in particular industries. A good example would be hospital mergers, in which I thought the merger retrospectives helped the FTC gain the courage, in a sense, to keep going and convince judges that they were right. Now, that does seem like a good use of the common law, in which evidence, as it accumulates, changes the law. So that gives me some confidence that if, in fact, the evidence keeps mounting, that we are lax on mergers, that it will have an effect on merger law, and judges will take that into account. But Let me just say one thing, and I wrote an article about this several years ago about merger retrospectives. You can't just look at the mergers where prices have gone up or the problematic ones. That's a self-selected sample. There's a ton of statistical problems. You know, if I just give you an example, suppose there are 100 mergers. Ex post, 50 of them are going to have a price that goes up, and say 50 have a price that goes down if I'm just sort of neutral on everything. Well, I don't want to say, oh, those 50 where the price went up were bad. You're not doing a good job. The real question is this. Can you identify beforehand those mergers where prices are going to go up? That's what we want to learn. That's what the agencies and maybe academics should be emphasizing in their research. Not just did price go up or down. I understand that's helpful, but we really want to know if you had the information available to the enforcers at the time, what would you have done differently? What models work best? What models don't work best? What models did you fail to use? That's what I'd like to know. And that's what's going to greatly improve what's going on. And just looking ex post is helpful, but not as helpful as it could be. So I think we can do much better on merger policy. I think we can refine our tools, especially the economists. I think the common law is perfectly able to take account of evidence. We have expert economists who can testify if merger studies in a particular industry show that mergers tend to lead to price increases. I think that's perfectly appropriate. In fact, I was in one such case. It was a vertical merger, the AT&T Time Warner case, and I used past activity to make projections as to what would happen in the future. So I think all of that is valuable. Retrospectives can be valuable. I think they can be greatly improved.
Steve?
And look, I don't think the retrospectives did not self-select mergers where prices went up. They found that prices went up as a result of the retrospective. So it was not a self-selected sample. It was a sample of mergers that were approved with consent decrees. And you know, Dennis, I agree that we could rely on the common law, and economists can work to try to get better tools. But yeah, gee, what are we going to do in the next 20 years before this happens? I mean, if you think that mergers have had under deterrence, under enforcement up till now, well, what you should do better is bring more cases, is be tougher, in general, be tougher. And courts should allow the government to win with less evidence. You should lower the government's burden of proof.
That might be, I think what I would say is that the economists should try and make sure they can develop tools that can do better at predicting these merger effects and convince courts that these are valuable tools, and that when the economist says it looks like prices are going up, the courts listen to them.
Yeah, but maybe the economists are not very good at developing these tools, and we should rely on the evidence so far and tighten up merger policy, lowering the HHI thresholds, lowering the burden of proof on the government on their prima facie case, raising the burden of proof on the parties to show efficiencies and other rebuttals. In short, maybe we should go back to Philadelphia National Bank rather than the state of things right now.
Well, I don't think anyone would suggest going back to the merger policies of the 60s. I mean, I think that would be a disaster.
Dennis,
so let me jump in.
Philadelphia National Bank, written by our mentor, Richard Posner.
Let me jump in and just, because I want to move along because we have a lot of time. So one thing that's interesting to me is that, if I'm correct about this, the ratio of economists to lawyers in the antitrust agency in the U.S. is high relative to what it is in Europe. We have the European authority, we have a smaller ratio of economists to lawyers. Yet enforcement in the U.S. is relatively low compared to what it is in Europe. So the question is, why haven't the economists in the U.S. risen up to have more impact? But that's really a political decision and something for a further study from someone's point of view. So let me move on because time is running short. I was really interested to hear what you guys had to say about one of the really important U.S. cases, which was the American Express case. I won't describe the case in detail, but you guys can do it when you discuss it. But what the Supreme Court opinion in American Express highlighted for many of us was the importance of two-sided markets. So Dennis, I thought maybe you'd start off because you know that case really well, and talk about what's happening. Are we now in the situation where every time one brings a case, one has to talk about two-sided markets, or is that something that's fairly unusual and unique?
Well, let's see, I have an article on this, and actually, Steve and I was remembering, Steve, you and I have an article many years ago discussing some of these problems, but my basic take on the American Express case, it's a very muddled decision, confusing economic concepts and market definition, and hopefully it can be done away with in some way. I should state at the outset that I have been adverse to credit card companies around the world. The American Express case in the United States was a case about steering at retail. I know in Europe you don't have to worry about that. You allow it, I believe, in many countries, if not all. But in the United States, the case was, can a merchant steer a customer into using a lower cost credit card, a lower cost debit card, or cash if, for example, it wanted to avoid paying high American Express fees? And the easiest way, let me just give two very simple insights into this case. Suppose Steve and I are two manufacturers of a product, the only two, and we sell through common retailers. And Steve and I are vicious competitors to each other. And if I lower my price, the retailer lowers the price of my product, and I steal sales from Steve. And then I meet Steve and I say, you know, why don't we adopt a policy in which you and I tell each of our common retailers they must charge the same price for Steve's product and the same price for Dennis's product. All of a sudden, Steve and I no longer have an incentive to lower price. Because if I lower price, the retailer won't lower his retail price. If I lower my wholesale price to the retailer won't lower the price, my price, compared to Steve's at retail because of this agreement. So in fact, Steve and I have an incentive to raise price, and our prices keep going up. That's what was at issue in the American Express case. Now, you know, you can start talking about free rider concerns. I'm going to ignore all that for now. And then there's one other way to think about the case. So that explains why Steve and I don't compete if we are manufacturers. So that would be like Visa, MasterCard, Amex wouldn't have an incentive to compete against each other. But there's another way to think about it. Imagine that all the rich people, and it's the rich people or the richer people who have credit cards, get together and they say, you know, retailers, we want you to start charge the same price when people use a credit card or when people use cash, even if a credit card is really expensive. Well, that's like a cartel of buyers, of all the rich getting together, acting through American Express to place a tax on the poor, on the cash customers who tend not to be so rich. So if you're worried about Steve's distribution of income. And that is another way to think about what's going on. So what I think happens now in the American Express case, the American Express case said, this is a two-sided market. In a two-sided market, you must define a market based on firms that deal with both sides, and you can't look just at one side or the other. Now, from an economic point of view, an economist can deal with that, okay? Because an economist uses just market definition to begin an analysis. He really looks at the full effects on both sides. But from the legal point of view, it has an enormous effect because it allowed the Supreme Court to dismiss the American Express case, in my mind, based on legal formalism, even in the face of evidence that there were harmful effects on, say, preventing entry and expansion. And I urge everybody to read Breyer's dissent, because it explains the very muddled logic and economic errors that the Supreme Court majority has made. And do I think it's had a bad effect? We'll talk later, or in a second, about a merger case where it has. So I think there's now a different standard for two-sided markets versus one-sided markets. The Supreme Court's definition of two-sided markets is very confused, and the criteria, economic criteria they articulate in that case have really make a muddle of the economic logic of two-sided markets. So
Dennis, I got to stop you because I want to give Steve a chance. But I'll just say before, Steve, I turn it over to you. I actually think it's one of the most muddled and problematic decisions in quite some time myself. But Steve, what's your take?
I would not use the word muddled. I would use the word abysmal to describe the opinion. The rejection of direct evidence of anti-competitive effects to infer market power, which is, key aspect of the opinion, that's a 25-year backward step in antitrust. We economists, we forward-looking antitrust people have worked really hard to get courts to focus on competitive effects rather than just relying on market shares. The previous law got it right, American Express got it wrong. Secondly, the court, in what should be an embarrassment, they said evidence that the anti-steering rules were pro-competitive is indicated by the fact that credit card usage has been rising over time. Oh, it must be good because the people are using credit cards more. So they pretended that the growth in credit card usage was the cause of the increase. I'm sorry, that those new steering rules were the cause of increased usage, rather than being an effect of a growing economy, or of the effect of the no steering rules led to people to overuse credit cards. In fact, I think in this case, if economists would study it, they'd probably find that credit card usage exceeds the competitive level because of this dynamic. Yeah, the rich people use cards, they get the rewards, but then the middle class people say, hey, rather than get screwed by paying cash, I'm going to get a card too. Even if I get a small reward, it's better than nothing. And so there's a stampede effect of more and more people using cards. And that's an implication in the model as well. As for the effects, I think you all know about the Sabre Fairlogics case, which the CMA rejected. Well, the case in the US, Sabre won. And it's really bizarre. I mean, the court found that the parties did compete, but it said, oh yeah, well, I certainly found evidence that they compete, but I have to apply American Express. And when I apply American Express, they don't compete because Fairlogics only competes on one side of the two-sided market. They disintermediate, they work with airlines to create the two-sided product. Sabre competes on both sides, and so in a two-sided market, Sabre and Fairlogics don't compete, and therefore the merger's permitted. So that case just shows what a mess American Express has caused and why it needs to be limited.
Thanks, Steve. Michaela, I need to check with you because actually, believe it or not, we've actually used up almost 40 minutes. How much more time do we have?
5 more minutes, is that okay?
Sure. I just want to stay on this topic. Actually, Sabre Fairlogics, which I'm not sure everyone knows because it was only a case in the CMA over in Europe, is an important example. I agree with Steve of the problems the courts now face in the US as a result of Amex. But whatever you think of the merits of that case, and I actually was involved in it, so I have a point of view, but it's created a problem that Steve, I think, correctly described. Our courts required now in every case to look, or economists to look at both sides of every market, or is it just transactions markets? What do transaction markets mean? And if so, can you define a market on one side and not the other side, or do you need to have to define markets on both sides? What's your take on that, Dennis?
Let me add a couple. Let me add something.
All right, go ahead, Steve.
And that is that Mike Katz was the expert for the government at the district court, and the DOJ looked at both sides of the market in Amex. They did the analysis, and they concluded that the rewards did not offset the harmful effects on prices. So it's not that it wasn't taken into account. Rather, they took it into account in the context of defining a single market, the credit card services to merchants, but then they traced through the effects on the other side of the market. That was not good enough for the Supreme Court.
Right.
What the Supreme Court could have done in that case was remanded to the district court to define the market correctly. Had it done that, they just would have redefined the market to be the two-sided market. The market shares would have stayed the same. The barriers to entry would have been the same. And then you would have been able to say, well, in that two-sided market, consumers are harmed. But instead, the court, perhaps because it's made up of rich guys, they simply ended the case rather than remanding it.
Yeah, that was exactly why I said that it was a promotion of legal formalism over economic evidence. So to dismiss a case based on market definition, when the evidence, the economic evidence, is agreed by everybody to show harm to competition, is to me exactly the wrong way to go. And that is the precedent of American Express. I should also say the other thing that
this is also, I would add, this is why we can't count on the common law, because in general one can, but right now the Supreme Court's moving in the other direction. I mean, I guess I would characterize the courts generally as having drunk too much Borkian Kool-Aid, poured into a Frank Easterbrook cocktail, and as a result, they've had serious brain damage. So, I think we're really going to need to do something to change American Express and all that it reflects.
Well,
Dennis,
I guess
last
I'd say
word.
it's a little hard. I mean, I'd like to make judges smarter. If you have judges doing terrible things, I don't know what you can do. The only alternative is to make them smarter. I don't see how you can legislate, use your common sense. But if you could, I'd be all for it. I'm just, as a practical matter, I don't quite know what to rely on other than the common law and other than scholarly research that hopefully can influence the common law. If I think things are really bad, I think as a last resort, you can try and say, listen, if you ever get a case like American Express, you should ask Dennis, Steve, and Dan what to do, and not just make up this stuff. But, I don't know how to do that at a practical level. That's a problem.
Dennis,
for lawyers
Dennis,
who know how to delegate powers and create institutions with the right incentives.
Yeah, Dennis, you have to educate judges, but it's like children. Until the children get smart enough to make the responsible decisions, you tell them what to do.
All right. Well, listen, we agree that the three of us ought to be the ones who just dominate the market. That's the one area we all agree on. I want to thank both of you guys for joining us today. It's been fun to have this discussion. I think I've run out of time, but as you can tell, we could go on for hours if we had the time to do that. And if we have more time, it'd be fun to hear questions from all the people who are listening. But it's been a lot of fun doing this. Michal, back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, all three. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful debate. A lot of great points. By the way, you might want to look at the chat. There are some questions that were put up, and maybe just for yourselves, or if you want to answer some of them later on, by email. That's fine as well. And you can all join us. I mean, please stay with us because we're in the last 5 minutes of, this main part today. And everybody was extremely patient, for the last 5 hours. So this is a virtual toast. That's what we have right now. So, anybody who's brought their glass, I have a glass of water. This is, I think, the best drink in the world. The coffee is good and wine is good and everything is good, you know. So, Rupert, what do you have? What kind of virtual toast do you have?
I only have water myself because I'm in my office and I don't know where to find the champagne here. So sorry, but I guess other people have better drinks than we do. I see Stephen has water. Dennis has coffee.
Well, it's 11 a.m. here.
Right. It depends on the time zones as well. I completely agree. Yeah, but water is, and we actually, you know, although we're all in our homes and there are, you know, macro issues in this world which are going not necessarily in the right direction. I think we have a lot to celebrate, you know, in the Scola and in the competition community. We're growing, you know, every day. We're more than 500 right now, and we get a lot of new requests for new membership. It's partly a sign of the fact that competition law, at least outside the US, is becoming a big issue, and many more people are studying it and investing time in research. And I think part of it is as a tribute to a Scola that we are really we're growing, and this is because of all of you. This is because of your contribution. When we send out requests, when we want to create joint repositories of you know, short films so that people will have teaching materials. If this is for local creation of local antitrust chapters, and creating innovating programs there, wonderful, and putting students in contact, research students in contact with professors. All of these endeavors are because of you. So thank you everybody so much. This was a great first day. So, you know, I'm raising my water glass to everybody. And it's great to see everybody. Rupert, do you want to add anything?
Let's first have a drink.
Okay, good.
If I may add, Michal, thanks to you before all other people, because you were the driving force behind putting this up when Sophia and the other people from Porto told us that this wouldn't be happening in the real world as we had all imagined. The three of us, you, Peter, and I, were sort of debating, okay, how do we continue? And I think if it hadn't been for competition law in isolation talks by Magali and Orr, who had set this example, and if it hadn't been for your very clear statement from the outset, okay, we do that digitally, because we are discussing digital anyway all the time. So I think we wouldn't be here. So, but that's just from my side.
Well, it's a team effort. It's definitely a team effort. You know, everybody has contributed, and
have the shoulder
we're all
each
team
other sitting around here. Okay, I just wanted to, or if I may, I just wanted to turn your attention to, if you allow me to, Michal, to the annex sessions and to our other programs in the coming days. The annex session is basically the idea of having sessions that are sort of a bit more nicely placed for some people who have to go to bed earlier or later or so than Central Europeans. And we already had this morning a fantastic session hosted by first Wolfgang, then by Fabiana, with a panel on COVID and with a really very interesting panel. And now tonight there is still something going on. I can't believe it, but it's not yet over. So tonight, from my perspective, is I look it up, 6 p.m. Brussels time, or Porto time, if you so wish. And there will be the second annex session, and it is followed by a book presentation with Ariel Ezraki and Maurice Stuckey on their new book Competition Overdose. And so it's again packed with a lot of good talks and highlights and book launch, etc. And this continues tomorrow and on Saturday. So please, if you're not yet fully familiar with the program, do not just look on the main track basically, but also look into the annex sessions, which are fantastic as well. Tonight, I think, or are you there? You will chair. I don't see you right now, but probably you're there. Tomorrow in the morning, it's Magali then chairing another session with a book launch by Nicolas Petit, Nicolas' new book. Then in the evening, it's Juan. I think, Juan, I have seen you somewhere as well, Juan David Gutierrez. And if I understand correctly, there will be a bit in Portuguese there for the Spanish or rather Portuguese speaking community, a panel after that annexed session. Then on Saturday in the morning, and morning is always my talking now, yeah, my Eurocentric perspective. It's Masako Wakui from Japan chairing a panel with the book launch of Thomas Cheng after that. And finally, the final session on Saturdays, chaired by David Bosco, with the book launch by Victoria. I see you, Vicky, with your new book presented there. So there's huge things coming up. And of course, tomorrow it's the commissioner coming up and in the morning at 11:30. Please note that we rescheduled that because she had to, so the rescheduling is a couple of days ago, but a week ago. But the commissioner will be here at 11:30, and we expect your Q&A. And please grill her, because she is not so often with the academic community. I think she's more familiar with people from business communities, etc., questioning her. So tomorrow is our chance. She said she agreed to answering questions. So you should really do that with Madame Basteya tomorrow if you have questions. Oh, Oliver Budzinski, you know how to pronounce that name, or someone from Denmark there. Oliver, maybe you can tell us again how to pronounce the name correctly in Danish.
I learned only a little bit Danish, so if there's anyone from Denmark, he's probably better than me, but it's going to the direction of
I can put my hand up. I'm Danish.
Oh, yes, so you know better than me.
So the way I would pronounce it is Vestager. Vestager.
Okay.
I think she's pretty flexible in accepting different kinds of pronunciations. She's probably heard it all before.
It's certainly not the way I had pronounced it so far. So I will watch the recording tonight and try to memorize that and practice it for tomorrow. And in the afternoon tomorrow, we have a great other session with a special panel with tips for young academics. And I'm very happy that Michal, Jojo Monti, Danny Sokol agreed to be on that panel and to tell us how you make a successful career in antitrust scholarship. I'm very interested to hear what you give as tips to the young people. That's it from my side, Michal. I just wanted to run you through the program or the parts of the program that are sort of on the fringes apart from the main panels.
Wonderful. So thank you everybody for staying with us today. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I did. And we'll, for those interested, we'll see you tonight, at the annex session number 2. Otherwise, we'll see you either tomorrow at annex session number 3 in the morning or in the main event. So enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yo.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Fine, thank you. We can stop the recording.